Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is the third installment of our webinar series focused on emerging CCS markets. And in today's webinar, we'll be discussing CCS ambitions in South Africa and Nigeria. My name is Ruth Gabramadin, and I am the Advocacy and Communications Manager for the EMEA region for the Global CCS Institute, and I will be moderating today's discussions. Next slide. For those who might not be familiar with the Institute, the Global CCS Institute is an international think tank with a mission to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture and storage, which is a vital technology needed to tackle climate change and deliver climate neutrality. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. So this session will include a brief audience Q&A nearing the end, following panel discussions. So you can submit your questions using the Q&A function on the Zoom control panel that you see on the bottom of your screen. And we'll take some of your questions at the tail end of the webinar. And in the coming days, a recording of this webinar will be available on the Institute's website. So just a few introductory words just to capture the context around today's session. Both South Africa and Nigeria have been steadily pursuing CCS as a possible climate mitigation tool in their respective low carbon transition. In South Africa, CCS pilot projects are underway with CO2 storage sites on the horizon. And if launched, CCS efforts will have the potential to significantly mitigate emissions from the country's power sector, particularly from coal-fired plants, as that energy transition continues. Nigeria, too, has been eyeing the impacts that CCS can have. In 2021, the Nigerian government announced aims to reach net zero by 2060, of which CCS will play its part, hopefully. And while in the early stages, conversation with stakeholders, industrial stakeholders seeking to decarbonize are certainly going to help steer those ambitions even further. So speaking about that and more, we have four very insightful guests who will expand on CCS developments within that region. Joining us, we have Natalia Kolonchenko with the World Bank Group, who is the CCS lead and CCS Trust Fund lead and sector lead with the World Bank. Victor Osu, consultant with International Finance Corporation. We have Nai D'Souza, Director of Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage with the African Circular Business Alliance. And also Tafiq Danze, Manager of with the Council for Geoscience. I'm going to give the floor to our speakers. We're just going to begin with some opening remarks from our speakers before we jump into panel discussions. And Natalia, I'll give the floor over to you if you could just kind of expand on the work that you've been doing in the region and tell us a bit about your organization in terms of how you're supporting CCS.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you for giving us an opportunity to be part of this webinar. My name is Natalia Kolonchenko. I am sector lead in the South Asia Regional Department of World Bank, but at the same time, I'm leading the CCS Trust Fund in the World Bank. Can we move please to the next slide? So in my very quick presentation, I just want to give a kind of the full picture of how the World Bank is supporting CCS in different regions and in what specific scopes, so that to give the audience kind of understanding where the World Bank involved in developing countries and where we concentrate in the current stage. We have a so-called the Carbon Capture Utilization Trust Fund, which was set back in 2009 and supported by two donors, the government of Norway and the government of United Kingdom. Since 2009, we already allocated between 45 and 48 million for different programs. And we support different activities with the objective, very wide open objective on strength and capacity building, and create opportunities for developing countries to explore CCS potential and facilitate the inclusion of CCS into developing countries' low carbon strategies and policies. As I said, I know we support specific countries, but we also support global and regional analytics, and we've been doing this for already 13 years. However, we close our trust fund in about a year and a half. The major part, we have one exception in program in South Africa, which will continue for the next 6 months in 2024. But the essence, we're practically closing our operations after so many years of support. Can we move please to the next one slide? So I want to concentrate on the topics of this seminar, how we support South Africa and Nigeria. South Africa, we started quite a while ago, and we divided our support in 2 phases. The first phase was more analytical and exploratory, how we can work with the government of South Africa to support, and it was limited to 1.35 million budget. And we did 4 studies on legal and regulatory environment, technical economic CCS evaluation, stakeholder engagement, and capacity building. We completed this back in 2015. Out of this phase 1, we discussed and developed with the government of South Africa phase 2, in which we support specific pilot activities. Our focus is primary on supporting the storage assessment pilot on storage capacity in South Africa to see how stored CO2 behaves and whether the geological formation will be suitable for larger scale CO2 geological storage. But we also, a smaller part will support CO2 capture pilot project. We'll do technology assessment and front-end engineering design on one of the power installations. The status of this project is ongoing, and as I said, it will be closed in June 2024. The next one, please. Our newest engagement is in Nigeria, and it was in response to a request provided by the Office of Vice President of the Government of Nigeria, which we very much appreciated, and we were ready to support it. We allocated 8.5 million from the trust fund for this support in providing partially financing through International Finance Corporation, and Victor will speak to that, and also some part through the World Bank to support legal and regulatory studies. These activities concentrate on industrial application of CCS. Nigeria has gas power plants. However, the application of CCS is not exactly economical, and secondly, the focus of activities right now all over the world is going on the application of CCS in hard-to-abate sectors such as industrial sector. I won't stop on activities because I have Victor speaking after me, but we started the project, and we hope that in a year and a half, we will be ready to show some results. The next one, please. I also would like to present that we do global analytics. We just completed the Carbonized natural gas study, for which we will be holding workshops in the middle of June, and this the study assessed the role of natural gas with CCS across a range of climate mitigation scenarios. We have some interesting finding, and I won't spoil it. I encourage you to participate in these workshops. It will be announced shortly. And we also did some interesting case studies in different countries, in different economies, and in countries with different availability of natural gas as resource for industries, for power generation, and with specific focus on blue hydrogen as one of the promising applications for CCUS. We also, in the middle of completing a study on CCS in Pan-Arab region, which concerns several countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And we have the industrial CCS program, which covers, again, a broad range application of CCS in industries. And we would like, before we close the trust fund, to complete 2 flagship studies, one of the negative emissions with the application of CCS like direct air capture and bioenergy CCS, and also to provide again a global good which requested by our clients in benchmarking cost for CCS in developing countries, because for many emerging and developing economies, even if they want to apply CCS, there is no benchmark, and we always know when we talk to the clients, that's what they're looking at, where we can at least to have a range where what we are talking about. That's what we've done, we planned, and I think it's all in my presentation. Ruth, how we move to the Q&A. And I also, for Q&A, I want to bring my colleague Brendan back, who works with us, who also worked on the CCS Trust Fund for a long time. So he will be also providing answers to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to bring in Dr. Victor Osu with the International Finance Corporation. I know that, Victor, you work alongside Natalia, so maybe you can kind of expand a little bit more about your role and your interest in CCS and so on.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are, and also Natalia, thank you very much. So my name is Dr. Victor Osu. I'm consultant to the International Financial Corporation, and basically supporting the corporation in terms of the World Bank Group to facilitate CCUS development in Nigeria. So one of the key things about Nigeria in driving this is because of its nature. First of all, we all know Nigeria is an oil and gas country, and the prospect of it driving that process means that it has to also be committed to the climate, the NDC, and also decarbonization and energy transition. Just last year, the country pledged to get to net zero target by 2060. In light of that, it has produced or designed and developed a lot of policies and strategy. One of them, such as the NDC update, the decarbonization policy, and just recently the energy transition plan, where it inserted the carbon capture storage as a key decarbonization pathway that would drive Nigeria's low carbon future. In doing that, certain sectors were identified, and these sectors, the energy sector, building sector, agricultural transport sector, they were very key sectors that was identified, including the industrial sector. Nigeria thrive much more in industry, and the industry sector today is actually growing so fast. Recently, we have the fertilizer industry coming up that was just launched. I think sometime this year. We also have the chemical industry launch. Also, cement is also growing, and then you start thinking about all this industry that are actually churning out a lot of social economic development, but within the pathway of producing climate change issues. And so that became a very key critical industry for the government to see, okay, aside from the oil and gas sector, what other sector are we going to look at to drive CCUS? And industry sector became a paramount, because that is where Nigeria intends to drive its social economic development, number one. Number two, use that as part of its climate commitment. And I think thirdly, also support creating jobs, revenues, and value add. And in that way, back in 2021, we started off with a capacity building context with the International Energy Agency, where we introduced the carbon capture utilization opportunity and opportunity for Nigeria. We also used that medium to build what we call the CCS strategic program, which Natalia also presented during our slide. And after that, we have the World Bank Group supporting us to drive that process. And that process means that they will be taking that strategy of the program to drive potential activities that will support Nigeria's CCS development. Such activities include one, storage, identification of emission sources. Number two, storage capacity and potential within areas where we can actually also have what we call the CC hubs, and where we can have geological formation and infrastructures which could be repurposed for carbon capture storage. We also will be looking at, within that context of the first phase of the activity, we'll also be, they'll be supporting also, the World Bank Group will be supporting the country Nigeria with identifying potential pilot opportunities that can serve the private sector and which the government can also key in to drive the process. And then a lot of capacity building, which we feel that is going to be very necessary to drive this process. All in all, we emphasize that together with the stakeholders, the World Bank Group, and the government of Nigeria, and its stakeholders, and especially the private sectors, which is the main focal point to drive this process within the industry sectors. We're looking at a robust CCS market in Nigeria and probably beyond Nigeria into African countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. Certainly, there sounds like there's a lot of opportunities in Nigeria, so it's certainly exciting. Next, maybe I'll bring in Tawfiq, actually, who's with the Council for Geoscience, just to say a few words, and then we'll pass it on to Nai. So, Tawfiq, Danzai.
Thank you, Ruth. Afternoon, everybody, or morning. Yes, my name is Tawfiq Dansai. I'm currently the Manager of Minerals and Energy at the Council for Geoscience and overseeing the implementation of our carbon capture, utilization and storage project. A little bit about the Council for Geoscience. We are a public entity, so we are an entity of state in South Africa, and we are essentially the curators of all geoscience data and information in South Africa. Our function towards CCUS has largely been towards establishing storage potential in South Africa, identifying storage sites, and then within the larger context of the Minerals and Energy Program, trying to establish a roadmap for CCUS linked to South Africa's socio-economic development plan. So of course, one of our key focus areas has been the just transition. South Africa is currently the largest CO2 emitter on the African continent, and one of the largest rates of emitters, CO2 emitters in the world. There's a number of policy documents that the South African government has put together, largely focused towards, number one, sustainable energy generation, but also decarbonization, or at least a transition towards a low carbon economy. Being as dependent on coal and other hydrocarbon resources as we are, CCUS becomes a very key aspect in terms of enabling this type of transition. So what we've done recently within the Council for Geoscience, we have a project that is co-funded by the World Bank and also the South African government, and that is largely towards establishing a pilot plant in South Africa. This would be the first CCUS pilot plant in the country, and we've identified a number of possible sites. More recently, we've identified some unconventional storage potential that is proximal to some of our largest CO2 emitters. The South African government has also released a carbon tax to try and initiate a decarbonization, essentially, of major emitters. So it became quite critical for us to establish the pilot plant proximal to some of these emitters. Currently, some of our emitters include some of the largest point source CO2 emitters in the world, largely linked to our coal to liquid industry. We've now identified some potentially large storage sites proximal to these locations. And part of the pilot project, we are aiming towards establishing a 10,000 ton storage plant within the next 2 years that will ultimately be scaled up to a commercially viable site, which we're hoping for. Beyond this as well, the findings of this type of work is targeted towards establishing additional policies. So in very similar geological environments that we might find in other regions, and then also in terms of potentially further utilization within the just transition of coal and other hydrocarbon energy sources. Thank you.
Thanks, Tawfiq. And lastly, we're going to have Nai D'Souza, who's the Director for Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage with the African Circular Business Alliance. Nai.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Nai D'Souza. So ACPA is a fact-based organization that uses intensive research to galvanize the African economic paradigm on multiple sectors and provide circular business growth strategies related to energy transition, mainly in the African countries which have not yet implemented CCUS on the political agenda. So when it comes to CCUS, my role at ACPA is to put together the best stakeholders and partners from the public and private sectors and influencing them to use innovative strategies for the generation of a functional carbon markets in the economies based on strong regulatory frameworks and innovative transition technologies. So in the present days, the equations still remain overfunded, unfortunately. And when it comes to emerging economies, due to the higher costs affiliated in setting up the initial infrastructure, the questions are always raised around what are the best assets and the best stakeholders to put together so they can, in a conjoint venture, support the energy transition and start deploying carbon capture for projects initiatives. So in a nutshell, ACPA is using the strong voice and the innovative expertise of the youngest African generations to play and influence the African society to consider the pathway and to get to the Africa we want, as we must go through the energy transition for addressing the issues around energy poverty, underdevelopment, and climate change, which are our main focus in ACPA. So my role is to put together the right stakeholders and implement the circular economic paradigm to reduce the financial risks involved in pilot projects of CCUS.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for those words. I think we're going to now move on to the panel discussion. So if everyone can just turn on their cameras and microphones, and then we'll just move ahead with that. But I think I probably want to continue with Nai, actually, who made a good point about engaging stakeholders when it comes to launching CCS. What are some of the trends when it comes to opportunities or challenges that you're seeing, Nai, with respect to conversations around CCS?
So the potential storage itself, when it comes to network geological potential in the Southern Africa region, it is huge, and it's a good opportunity to and potential to establish CCS regional networks linking CO2 emitting sources and sequestration sites across different countries within the region. So I think that these are the opportunities among the many challenges that we have. For example, the higher level of reliance on fossil fuel is one of the challenges that makes many African countries are still dependent on fossil fuels for energy generations, since fossil fuel remains a vast energy resource and it's widely distributed around the world. There is also the big challenges that the region is poor, and when it comes to the energy sector and the energy system, and the electricity network interdependency, which is not a reality. And there are also the challenge of legal and regulatory barriers that are still to define. There are many gaps, and there are a variety of suggested approach There is also the gap of technical barriers that we still have to capacity building the young force. We are a younger generation. So for me and Aqua see this as a good opportunity to implement CCUS in the economic paradigm of Africa.
And just sticking to the conversation around opportunities and potential roadmaps to the energy transition. Tawfiq, you mentioned pilot projects and CO2 storage potential. What do you think is the key driver really when it comes to CCS deployment in South Africa specifically?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. So the most critical one recently has been the actual baseload energy requirements. South Africa is in a very interesting situation, trying to balance our energy requirements and our social and economic development agenda. So currently coal, for example, is the largest contributor towards mining's GDP. And especially in the context of the post-COVID-19 economic recovery that the country has been facing, we found now that there's been a big increase in actual coal development. But obviously this does not align to our national development imperatives, which actually is targeting about a 50% CO2 reduction in the next 8 years for 2030. So crucially, the industry has really been looking at CCUS as the potential gap now to enable just transition. So with that, the pilot plant will also need to look at the possible policy mechanisms. So one of the things that we are trying to develop within our pilot project is a white paper on the establishment of CCUS. Of course, the idea would be that once the technology has been proven and there's been a de-risking in terms of investment, the commercialization would then be able to be rolled out. South Africa has also established a carbon tax. So we essentially have about, it's something like $10 per ton of CO2 emitted. And because of the large quantities of CO2 that we are emitting, especially in industry, there's a very big discrepancy between the types of developmental agendas in terms of the coal and hydrocarbon industries, and of course the decarbonization. So crucially, one of the things that is really now missing at the moment is this link between the continued energy development and the CO2 reduction. And I think this is where the aspect of the pilot plant becomes really crucial, where we use the learnings from this pilot plant in terms of the different types of geological domains, number one, to establish a true storage potential, and then how that can actually assist in terms of the further just transition of utilization of the coal resources that we have. The other one that was also mentioned was about the natural gas that I think Natalia mentioned. So in South Africa, we don't just have the coal seams that are shallow in terms of mineable through the classical ways of the coal being mined, but we also have this opportunity for coal bed methane and underground gasification. And these types of technologies also enable a large portion of CO2 to be released from these coal seams. And that can also establish further support for CCUS technologies. In addition, there's also the release of hydrogen during these type of operations. So I think it's actually now tying all of these aspects together and then using the learnings from some type of experimental pilot plant and then using that to actually generate the right type of policy framework to enable this. But certainly this is something we're hoping to publish within the next few years. Thanks, Ruth.
I do want to get into conversation on funding mechanisms with Natalia, but first maybe Victor, just to your point, you mentioned the 2060 net zero target that Nigeria made, and maybe you can kind of expand on how CCS will play a role and how exactly stakeholders can, well, specifically industry stakeholders can help in that effort. I know it's not really exactly early days, but I know the conversation of CCS in Nigeria has been longstanding. So where does CCS fit in that, do you think, especially following that announcement at COP?
Well, thank you very much. Again, when we started off with the energy plan, the energy transition planning, it was more of like looking at it in a way, what pathways will Nigeria use to get to that target? Initially 2050, yes, but when we did a little bit of assumptions and we found out that 2050 might not be possible, 2060 became that target. We started off looking at business as usual, and okay, today, if we still go on with this process of not embedding low carbon pathways towards our social economic development, how will it look like? And then we went into the NDC. After updating the NDC, we did a bit of modeling and found that we'll probably not get to that net zero by 2060 if we also, leverage on NDC. And then we started asking ourselves, what are those gaps? The gaps that could actually support. Yes, a lot of renewable energy was there, a lot of energy efficiency, but I think carbon emission now became very critical to us to say, okay, we need to actually get this from point of source. And CCUS came into that topic. There was a little bit of that back and forth towards CCUS because, again, knowing what the global community are looking into when it comes to CCUS, I think the focus is everybody saying enhanced oil recovery or it's going to the oil and gas. But again, it's I think it's a mindset towards people thinking that CCUS is just a level playing ground for the oil and gas industry. And so what Nigeria took on board was to look at it holistically and say, okay, which of these sectors? So because of the characterization of our sectors, the industry sector, energy, transport, and agricultural sector, even the oil and gas sector, industry sector became a very key option for us. And I did mention at the beginning of my remarks that became a place or a sector that we wanted to dig deep and support the decarbonization process. And then we termed that industrial decarbonization. Why? Because those are hard to abate sectors. And CCUS was going to come in very handy, very handy. Now, aside from the climate commitment and the social economic opportunity, we also looked at the value, the energy, the value coming from that CCUS. Number one, the industry sector, majority of them, the people that we've engaged with, especially private sectors, looking at they utilize CO2 to produce ammonia using urea, and so that becomes an incentive for them, utilization. So now, basically, the private sectors will be looking at one thing critically. If we're going to get into this, and I think this follows through our pre-engagement exercise that we've been having, that we started off since March up to today, where we've engaged with different stakeholders from the oil and gas sector, industry sector, cement industry, chemical, fertilizer, iron and steel, name them. And one of the critical things is they are interested, but what is that incentive that we need to bring to them? So it's not just about, oh, okay, CCUS has to be that climate commitment, but we need to be incentivized to make us commit ourselves and what will be the role of the government. And I think that whole package of stakeholders engagement really brought into light significant understanding on how CCUS, in particular this in Nigeria, will be able to strive. And so I think it's been a very good journey, and we see that stakeholders are very interested, but we need to start looking at what will make them, start committing themselves into CCUS.
Yeah, and I think, thanks, Victor. And certainly I think the conversation around building an incentive and subsequently a business case for CCS is really going to be what ultimately helps to drive it. And Natalia, you mentioned that the CCS Trust Fund at the World Bank is concluding next year. Could you maybe speak to possibly what happens after that, or where you would like to see the next steps happening? Can it be renewed? What's going to be the state of CCS when that program wraps up? And maybe just talk about funding mechanisms more broadly if we can.
Thank you, Ruth. We are still in discussions with current donors, potential donors, whether in what form and how we can continue this work. For administrative reasons, the trust fund is very old, so for administratively we have to close. And if we continue doing something similar, we have to reopen under a new World Bank. We have specific requirements, and this old trust fund does not fit in any longer. So that's one of the reasons. But substantively, yes, it's actually for the last 2 years we have more demand than for the previous 10. So basically, it's maybe the right time right now for CCS. And unfortunately, we were building, but more unfortunately, because of this, we've been building capacity for 10 years. It finally came into fruition that we have a lot of demand for our support. We support support is grant-based, and potentially the next phase will be again to engage some sort of alternative funding, which is related to climate finance, and also the government incentive. And Tofik mentioned, carbon tax. That's exactly where the money for climate mitigation technologies, especially those which do not generate multiple streams of revenues, like CCS. It's not a renewable, it's actually energy and resource consuming. So you have to think whether, if it's not poly generation, then you have to subsidize. And the biggest advantage of CCS is its mitigation potential. So there are several mechanisms which can be used, and maybe I'll just turn over to Brendan, because we were working with different, like Clean Energy Ministerial, with different organizations to explore additional financial mechanisms that can support CCS. Brendan, over to you, please.
Yeah, thanks, Natalia. Yes, I think there are a range of different financial mechanisms being explored. Some top-down mechanisms, such as those under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, where different countries can collaborate on investment of climate mitigation projects. And there's definitely a strong impetus for the inclusion of CCS under the Article 6, as it was included under the Clean Development Mechanism. In parallel, I think more and more we're seeing economic drivers for the deployment of CCS. In particular, you see mechanisms such as the carbon border adjustment mechanism being discussed, where exporting countries may become exposed to carbon prices in importing countries. And I think this becomes particularly important for organizations and companies in developing and emerging countries who want to export to, for example, Europe or the US, may be forced to take on CO2 abatement measures in order to keep their exports competitive in that global market. And we see that being discussed quite heavily already in the natural gas export and LNG export market. So I think, yes, there's a range of different financial mechanisms that are emerging. And I think more and more developing and emerging economies are going to have to be cognizant of that.
Yes. And maybe I can, yeah, go ahead then.
Yeah, I also think that implementing the circular economy paradigm in itself can help to reduce the connection risks, and it allows a more affordable carbon management in a perspective that it uses, for example, blockchain in their distribution processes. For example, when it comes to find a solution for the lack of access to electricity, we can imagine a blockchain-based energy system integrated on a CCS regulatory framework in which finances are always recognized, and the processes for this process of integrating the regulatory frameworks and the blockchain that could also incentivize smart contracts that ensure electricity would only be requested when local green energy is available in nearby cities, for example, such as Lagos, Cape Town, or even Uganda. I think that this can provide the greatest incentives and opportunities for stakeholders, which are just as the World Bank and and business owners that can also raise potential new markets for further investments in a more efficient green energy systems. And then when someone asks us, why am I talking about blockchain in a discussion, during a discussion of CCS seminar, is actually because the answer is exactly because the Africa's potential to transform its energy system within the climate limits, it requires a diverse portfolio of solutions, and in which finances are always recognized as the main constraint. So it will depend on how bold we are and where our innovation skills can go. And it requires strong governmental support, and embracing, the government should embrace the implementation of strongest regulatory frameworks, what the public sector offer fair opportunities to entrepreneurs and business owners to prepare themselves in a transition to transition their industrial processes in a compromised way. So I think this also pushes the financial and reduces the financial risks.
Thanks, Mai. And Tawfiq, do you want to weigh in on this kind of conversation? I see that the Q&A is, someone in the Q&A asked something similar, but where do you see legislation around kind of carbon removals developing in South Africa? Where do you see it headed? And where would you like to see it headed?
Yeah, so one of the key things that we've picked up recently is that part of the geological investigations in changing the narrative about storability in South Africa. So we know we mentioned the concept of these unconventional sources. There was a significant narrative that, for example, some of these type of reactive basaltic rocks. So these would specifically be rocks with a type of mineralogy that would readily react with CO2. We did not maybe have enough of this type of basaltic rocks in the country. And therefore, we had a perspective in terms of how much CO2 storability does the country actually have. But recent geological investigations have now actually changed that to show that South Africa does have potentially significantly larger storability. Now, that is a direct link to the actual drivers behind the type of regulatory framework, because obviously, assuming that the storage potential is much less, that then has a negative effect in terms of the regulatory framework, where it's not maybe viewed as an economically viable technology. However, now with these type of geological investigations, we actually see there's a very direct link towards us developing a white paper in terms of how do we actually do this. So this also enables the additional type of R&D required. So one of the key drivers, and I mean, this is maybe quite an exciting aspect that we've picked up recently, is that we do need a very large water volume of water to actually enable the CCUS technology in South Africa. But at the same time, we also have, being a mining industry, we have a lot of acidic waters that's being developed. So there's two types of regulatory framework that we're now dealing with in terms of how does the country deal with acidic waters developed from mining, but at the same time, we can potentially use these waters to actually enable something like CCUS. So that is a situation where we're looking at a, let's call it a regulatory universe in terms of the country, in terms of how do we actually focus on environmental existence, and also how do we continue with the mineral development industry. So within this context, this minerals and energy theme in the South African government, we're now trying to close the gaps between these various types of technology that can enable something like a just transition, something like the economic development, and then also in terms of these type of climate change regulations. So currently what we have done is we've drafted a white paper. If we look at the South African example, the idea would be that this white paper now gets, let's say, charted in terms of the type of technology development within the pilot plant. And then that would actually then, move forward in terms of its actual development. And the ultimate goal that we're hoping to achieve is that if this work actually becomes successful, this will enable these type of commercial industries to kind of take advantage of this. And there would be a regulatory framework in terms of how could this technologies actually be enabled in South Africa. And then similarly, in terms of how that then links to the climate change mitigation scenarios. Thanks, Ruth.
Thanks, Sophie. And Brendan Beck from the World Bank. Sorry, we didn't introduce him in the beginning. He was here just as a supporting role, but looks like he wants to jump in, which is wonderful. Brendan, you have something to say?
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on an important point that Tawfiq highlighted, and that's around the sort of cross-cutting nature of the carbon capture and storage value chain. And the implications, I guess, that has on the legal and regulatory frameworks necessary to govern the technology. A key area of support that the CCS Trust Fund has done in South Africa and elsewhere has been sort of understanding how CCS could fit into the existing legal and regulatory framework, identifying perhaps gaps and barriers that exist to CCS in the current environment, and then identifying potential options for creating a more comprehensive regulatory framework for CCS looking forward, and a regulatory framework that sort of addresses some of the points that Tawfiq highlights, both on the sort of environmental and social impacts of CCS, but also on how it relates to perhaps climate mitigation policies and the like. So the options paper we did in South Africa then identified 4 different pathways that the South African government could consider to regulating CCS. And then that then falls into the jurisdiction of the South African government to identify which pathway is most suitable and get that framework in place. And within the trust fund, we're doing similar programs with Mexico, and we have one planned with Nigeria. And just to touch on one of the other comments highlighted in the Q&A, the work we do in this area really builds on an extensive body of knowledge from Europe, from the US, from Canada and Australia, who have in place legal and regulatory frameworks for CCS. So putting in place a legal and regulatory framework is not a novel thing. There are fairly well understood approaches to different aspects of CCS, and it's just a matter of sort of applying them in each country that wants to develop CCS to make sure those lessons are learned and we can build on that experience. And we work with the likes of the International Energy Agency, who have done a lot of work compiling best practice and lessons learned around CCS legal and regulatory frameworks. And I'm happy to point people towards those resources if they're interested.
Thanks, Brendan. We're kind of close in terms of time, so I will move over to audience Q&A in a bit. But Tawfiq, you mentioned a project or 2 years. You mentioned potentially in 2 years there'll be a project. Can you expand a little bit on that, on kind of the context of what you were speaking about? I think that's somewhat exciting. If you can maybe share those details with our audience.
Yes, so we've identified a storage site in the Mpumalanga province. This is quite a significant achievement for us, I think, mostly because the Mpumalanga province, for those who don't know South Africa, that is what we call the energy basket of the country. So it has most of our significant coal fields and also most of the coal-fired energy plants. Most of these coal-fired energy plants, I can also add, are due for decommissioning in the next 10 years. However, of course, it creates a very significant challenge, because this is also the major contributor towards the socio-economic development in the province. So we have approximately 200,000 people that are directly linked to the coal industry in the province. And one of the key challenges has been now, how does the province actually undergo this just transition away from the coal industries? So what we've done is we've had a look at some of our geological data. We're quite fortunate at the Council for Geoscience. We have a borehole library and a hyperspectral core scanner. So we were able to digitally look at all of the boreholes in the region, and we identified potentially significant storage reservoirs within the province. We've undertaken most of the requisite geological investigations, including looking at the porosity, looking at mineralogy, petrography, etc. And now we're looking at the type of reactability in terms of the fluids we can use. The plan is that for this year, we are targeting to start drilling, to do some pilot holes, of course, to verify the reservoir, and then to obviously convert those pilot holes into productive holes. That will then link to the front-end engineering and design in terms of developing the actual pilot plant. With that being said, then we hope to actually use CO2. The target at the moment is to actually use CO2 from the coal to liquid industry. We feel that's quite critical because it goes from essentially a source to sink of CO2. And the idea would be that within the next 2 years, we then have the 10,000 tons of CO2 sequestered into these reservoirs. I also, open the floor to all the panelists and to everybody. If they want more information, they can contact the Council for Geoscience on this. But we have some of the publications that are now coming out as well on this work. And the ultimate goal of this would be that if these type of unconventional resources actually works within the province, we can also expand it to other areas in the country where we still have a lot of coal potential. One of the long-term goals I might want to add is that ultimately with this just transition, we might move away from these large coal projects, but instead have a lot of these modular sized coal plants. We're looking maybe 1,000 megawatts of energy generation, and that would then be supported directly with a CCUS plant to ensure that actually the CO2 is completely offset. And then of course use technologies such as maybe pre-combustion capture to really now enhance the type of CO2 reduction that can be made from this. So yeah, we're really hoping that within the next 2 years, this will be a successful project. Essentially, everything has been done. We're now focusing on things like the finalization of the full ESIA and the finalization of a lot of the lab type of experiments in terms of the fluids that will be used to support the CO2 sequestration. Thanks, Ruth.
Thanks. I'm now going to move on to some of the audience questions. I'm seeing a lot of similar questions pop up, so I might just make them my own. So there are a lot of CCS projects now in development. I believe it's 172. Only a few of those are fully operational, but needless to say, there's a lot of CCS project planners globally, you know, in Europe, North America, and so on. So can you speak to what learnings we're taking from CCS projects that are already out there? Do we, you know, is there any sort of collaborations happening? Maybe Tawfiq or Brendan, you could speak to that. How are we utilizing those learnings?
Yeah, I guess from the perspective of the CCS Trust Fund, understanding learnings from existing projects and projects under development is really critical because that's the knowledge and the capacity we need to share with countries new to CCS. And so something we've done as part of the CCS Trust Fund is we've ran capacity building programs. We took a South African delegation to the US, saw projects in Boundary Dam in Canada, the Petronova project in Houston, both to see the projects firsthand, but also to connect stakeholders in South Africa with stakeholders in these countries and the project proponents there. And then as we work with countries to develop projects, we are constantly trying to facilitate that flow of information. And for example, bring in consultants with experience of projects in developed countries and have them work to support the development and scoping of projects in developing countries. So that's something that we're very, very cognizant of.
And I think, Nai, did you want to weigh in?
Okay, the learnings from my end are regarding the policies mainly. For example, in paradigms, for example, in the case of Angola, there are a current problem that is happening is that the public sector is somehow doing, not the public sector, I mean the private sector in countries that have not yet implemented the CCUS and their political and climate issue agenda. The government leaves the public sector to somehow do the work in almost individually way. Because, for example, they use the external funding that comes from companies such as Total Energies, for example, to allocate the funding for the renewable energies. But actually, there is a lot that the governments can do, and it is exactly to start capacity building and start raising, collecting the map, because we know already that, for example, we have the storage capacities and we should start collecting data, starting assessing how is the real potential that those countries have in order to assess what are the best stakeholders that we can put together in order to start releasing and start deployment in CCUS. So for me, one of the main key takes is that we have to use the strong voices of the African young generation and use our innovation to raise a voice and start influencing the country, the governments to generate policies, implement them, and start implementing CCUS in their agenda. So for me, I think that this is critical and it's really important when it comes to addressing. First of all, when it comes to collect data on the different markets and business. For example, Africa, the Southern African region is increasing, and the cement industry is one of the main targets because there are a lot of construction, and we need to start making CCU policies that regulate the cement because it's increasing. We are among emerging economy, and it really needs to be thinking out of the box because energy system is not only related with oil and gas. There is always that can be done in different other industries, and cement is one of them. So it's crucial that the government should not only put the efforts and center the efforts of their agenda concentrated on the private sector, which is a huge problem in that occurs in the African context. So it should not be this way. We must act, and we must have the power to raise the voice and influence the government that they should do more. That's it.
Thanks, Mai. And just one last question, and I might pose it to Victor because it is being asked in the Nigerian context. How can public perception impact CCS deployment? Obviously, CCS is received and perceived differently depending on where you are, but how would that, you think, would affect deployment in Nigeria?
Yes, thank you very much. So I think what we've done, as I said, last year, we started off with a capacity building awareness program last year to commit Nigeria into looking at CCS. And there were a lot of diverse stakeholders that we brought in. We brought in from the regulatory perspective, CSOs, private sectors, public, just name them, even international community. And so we started, we got a lot of feedback from that, and that supported us to develop our current strategic CCS program, which we are currently trying to implement with the support of the World Bank Trust Fund. And so after that, within this context of starting this process, we didn't just jump in to say, okay, we've gotten the fund, let us start developing pilots, or let us start, going into the field. What we did was to, and that is a continuous process, is to have a deep conversation with key stakeholders. These key stakeholders are ranging from CSOs, associations, oil and gas, the industry sector, and also international sector, to see how we can bring them together, sit down together and discuss what can we do to make sure that this becomes a success. And I also mentioned that we were having interesting feedbacks, very, very interesting feedbacks, which we are, which is shaping the process and the activities on how to drive this process, how to drive the CCS development. And I think for us also, like, this platform is a very good platform for us to also tell the global world that, listen, we know that there are issues with concerns about CCS, but we can actually reframe what CCS is all about, and not look at it as potentially to enhance oil and gas sector, but could actually support industries such as the cement industry that is really growing right now. And thanks, Nia, for mentioning that, and other key chemical and fertilizer industry. We did give an example of some of these great in industries that will be speaking, and just to use this forum to say that next week Nigeria is launching that as the industrial CCS project on the 7th of June, and we're going to be listening to industries such as the cement, chemical industry, this and oil and gas, talking about the way CCS can support, to drive the process. And I believe that this could radically change the mindset of the public sector to now say, oh, okay, right, it's not about the oil and gas, but now it's about industry sectors, and these industries are very key to industrialization, especially for developing countries in Africa.
Absolutely. Thank you, Victor. And the conversation will continue beyond this webinar for sure. So it's been an interesting session, but unfortunately that is all the time we have today. So on behalf of the Global CCS Institute, I'd like to thank you all for being part of this panel discussion on CCS in South Africa and Nigeria, and of course, thank our audience for being here. Our Emerging CCS Market Series is ongoing, so please do head to our website for more information on that. If you'd like to learn more about CCS, you can read our Global Status of CCS report, which is free for download on our website at www.globalccsinstitute.com. If you are on social media, please follow us at Global CCS and feel free to interact. And if you have any additional questions, you can contact us directly at info@globalccsinstitute.com. Thanks again for joining us. Goodbye.